Hey MiniWarGamers, welcome to Ash's Indie Game Spotlight. First episode. So, before I dive into talking about today's indie game that we're going to cover, I should probably tell you what this show is going to be about. Indie Game Spotlight is going to be about talking about and showing you guys games that you may not have heard of. You might be watching this and go, well, of course I've heard of this game. But by and large, these are the game systems that don't have a huge audience. For now. Now, I personally am a huge lover of kitchen table games, smaller games, skirmish games, and for pretty simple reasons. You can collect and paint two armies usually pretty quickly for these games. You can play them on a small surface, so at home, and you can usually do the whole kit and caboodle. You can make scenery, a table, or whatever dedicated to each game before you start playing and get kind of the whole immersive experience. So, as I am the guy that likes independent games and indie games made by smaller companies, some of whom are only one person, one or two people, I thought it was appropriate that I did a show spotlighting and showcasing these games. Now, are these games going to get full coverage on MiniWarGaming? Probably not. You're not ever going to see us do a whole series dedicated to one of these indie games. I know. You love these games. You think they're awesome. You guys are the ones supporting those indie game companies. Continue to do so. I would encourage anybody who really loves those games to do that kind of coverage themselves. Make battle reports, post them online, and do your little bit in the internet universe to spread the word. This is my version of that. So I'm not going to do a whole show probably on them. Mostly because the audience just isn't that big, and I only have so much time. I'm going to focus on the shows I'm already doing because they have huge audiences and they're very successful. But these indie games, they deserve a little bit of time in the sun, and I thought it would be great to do maybe once a month a show where I pick an indie game and I do a quick run through of it. So we're going to do it in two parts. The first part, I'm going to talk about the game. That's going to be right here. You guys are watching it right now. Give you a general overview of the way the game works, and then two sort of separate discussion points. The first one is the familiar, the things this game does that you've probably seen in the MiniWar games that you already play. And then the innovative, the things it does differently, the reasons you might want to play it, that are something that would attract you to try out the game. And maybe you will go and try it out. Now the second part that we're going to do overall is I'm going to do a demo of the game. And the demo of the game is usually 2 or 3 turns, probably not the entirety of a game. We're not going to play through the whole thing, just to showcase some of the mechanics and what it looks like. Now, usually I only do this if I have the setup to do the game. So if there's an indie game you want me to cover, or if you are an indie game designer that wants to, shed some spotlights on your games, and you've got miniatures, you got stuff, if I don't have the stuff, I can't do a vault demo, and I can't really show off the pretty toys. So to start off this series, I'm going to do games that I already play and own, but if you guys have an indie game that you think should be covered, or if you're an indie game developer that wants to do it, please shoot me an email, ash@miniwargaming.com, and we can discuss maybe doing an indie gaming spotlight. I'm going to do them once a month. They're not going to be super regular, but that means 12 games a year. We'll get a little spotlight thrown on them, and we can show you what they look like, and what they look like in game terms, and maybe play through a few turns so you can actually see how they play. So I hope you enjoy this series, and I guess this bit of fan service, because we get lots and lots of requests for doing smaller, skirmish scale or other games, and we can't do them all. There's so many great miniature games, great war games out there. There's no way we could possibly hope to cover every single one. As usual, a lot of them are smaller. A lot of them are homebrewed games, do-it-yourself games, and companies that are really just 2 or 3 people. It doesn't look like it's just 2 or 3 people from their website, because from the look of a website, there's 1,000 employees, right? Every company looks like it's the same size from its website. But for the most part, these are cottage industry games that deserve a little bit of love, and we're going to show them off for you. So without any further ado, we're going to start with my first episode and talk about a game near and dear to my heart, which is Mercs by MegaCon Games. So let's talk about Mercs and MegaCon games in general. Mercs was originally, a lot like a few other miniature games that I can think of, like Malifaux by Weird Miniatures, just a model line. A great sculptor named Tom Mason decided he was going to sculpt some sort of character figures, some science fiction, near future soldiers that he called Mercs. And the original concepts were for guys called the CCC Yellow Jackets. And the Yellow Jackets were like a squad of near future sort of soldiers that he sculpted all himself. There's no game attached to them. They were just cool models. And I don't remember exactly the year, but it was probably 2008 or 2009 he was sculpting these miniatures. I think when I first saw them on Tabletop Gaming News. And they were very cool. And I went and bought them. And there's no game attached to them, but I'm a guy that if I like a model, I'll just go and buy it. So I went and bought them. Now, after a couple of years, those miniatures got, I think there's 4 or 5 of them in existence at the time. They got picked up by a guy named Brian Schotten and his friend Keith Lowe. Now, Brian and Keith, both of whom I haven't met Keith, but I met Brian. I've actually had dinner at his house. They designed a game. And now these guys came from a background of doing layout and design and rules design as well. If you've ever picked up the Diablo 3 strategy guide from Blizzard, I think Brian and Keith both worked on that. I know Brian did because he showed it to me when I was at his house. But excellent designers and layout guys. Brian, an excellent game designer as well, went and designed a game called Mercs. And this was the pilot game for what would eventually become called MegaCon Games. It was just called Mercs Minis at that point. And I picked it up. I already had the models, so when they put some free rules online for us to try out and try out the game, I jumped on it. I was like, hey, it's cool, it's a kitchen table game, it's near future, it's skirmish. I like all of these things. So I ordered all the models that were initially available in the first wave, and I started playing the game. Now, it did some really cool things, and we'll talk about those cool things right now. The first thing, obviously, it was near future, and this is where we're gonna get into the familiar part. So the first familiar thing you're gonna think about this is, it was near future. It's in a planet Earth, so a planet Earth, like our planet Earth, that's probably, I think, 100 and something years in the future. And it's got the usual sort of trope of there's now mega corporations that are trying to vie for control of the planet. And there's a lot of them. I'm not going to talk about all of them because there's a whole bunch. I think there's 12 in total that Brian's planning on doing factions for in the game. But I'm going to talk about just some major ones. The CCC, they are the Yellow Jackets, the original miniature sculpted by Tom. And they are sort of the Pan-American conglomerate. They're what we would think of as the America, Canada, and even parts of Mexico today sort of like joined together. The USCR, former Soviet bloc, forms into a Soviet corporation. They're a large corporation. Cefadu or Cefadu, I think it's Cefadu it's pronounced, is a African nation, sort of like a joined together corporation. And then there's the FCC, the Freedom from Corporate Control. And they're in what's called the Lost Margin, which is like a desolate wasteland in Eastern Europe where there was a corporate collapse and it's now like a no man's land. And they're basically freedom fighters. So think of them as like the dudes in the future, the humanity in the future in Terminator fighting against these like all-powerful corporations to try and be free. So that gives you an idea. Some of the factions and some of the models, they all kind of reflect that kind of look. High technology in the case of USCR, huge heavy power armor in the, high technology in the CCC, huge heavy power armor and brute force with the USCR, speed and dexterity with the Cefadu, and that sort of like freedom fightery ragtag look for the FCC. That gives you an idea of how they look and how they play even. They kind of play to those tropes. So that's familiar stuff. Also, it's dice-based, so it is a dice game. It's a miniature game that uses dice. I know that sounds like it's a thing that shouldn't be, that it shouldn't be something I shouldn't even have to talk about. But believe it or not all miniature games are played with dice. I've played miniature games that are played with cards. Malifaux, super popular, is played with just a deck of playing cards instead of dice. And there are games that are completely diceless that use just equations to determine who wins and loses for war games. So not as common as you think, but it's worth noting that it does use dice. It uses D10s in this case. So it's somewhere between 40k and infinity in terms of depths of variety in your troops. So between 1 and 10. As opposed to 1 and 6 and 1 and 20, you've got 1 and 10. And that's a good gauge. I really like D10 based games. It's just enough difference where a point on the dice isn't worth so much that it's game unbalancing, right? The difference between a 4+ and a 3+ is pretty huge on a D6, but the difference between a 10+ and an 11+ on a D20 is not that huge. I think 10's a happy medium. The difference between a 7+ and a 6+ is enough that it's important, but not enough that it's totally imbalancing. So that's one of the familiar things. To hit rolls are basically a target number like you would see in 40k, so 6+, 7+, 8+. You're not trying to roll under something weird like, or roll an exact number, which is the case in some games. It's just the usual, like roll higher than, equal to or higher than a certain target number. And then the usual sort of like hit points, just like wounds in 40k. You got blood in Mercs where you take a point of damage, you take a point of damage. Other systems can use things like a scale of how wounded you are. So for instance, if you've ever played heavy gear, you go from stunned to lightly damaged to a medium level damage to critically damaged to destroyed. And those levels aren't really wounds, they're how effective you still are in combat. And the more damaged you become, actually Confrontation 3.0 did that too, where you'd be lightly injured and then through critically injured. And what that is instead of using wounds, it's your efficiency in the game drops down. and you become more and more crippled. So that's a familiar thing. They just use wounds. There's no sort of like deleterious effects to being injured in this game. It's just a blood point system. And then finally, there's lots of factions, and those factions obviously are all indicative of the tropes that they're sort of representing. So if you were to look at USCR and see the miniatures, they play the way that they look, and that's a pretty common thing in war games. But the guys who are running tend to be fast. The guys who are wearing heavy armor tend to be slow. You can kind of take a look at the factions, and what you see is what you get. For an in-depth faction overview, you can go to my blog, actually WordPress.com. Sorry, GorillaMiniatureGames.wordpress.com. I have a faction overview that's been viewed about I think it's the most viewed page on my website actually for Mercs, because I got linked to like Board Game Geek and I think the Mercs webpage. So go look on there. Most of the factions are on there, and there's an overview of how they play and stuff like that. So there it is. There's the familiar. That's the stuff that if you were to get into Mercs or try out Mercs, that'd be all stuff that you'd recognize, and it's fairly comfortable for most wargamers. So now let's talk about the innovative. All right, so let's talk about some innovations in this game. Now, when I say innovations, I don't mean things that are completely unique. Now, other games will probably have these things too. I'm talking about things that are fairly uncommon in the greater sort of like miniature wargaming world, and that you might not see in the average game. So don't take this as like a list of things that only this game does. Take this as a list of things that are cool and different from the norm that this game can provide that you might not have seen before. So the first one, simultaneous game turn. Fairly uncommon in miniature wargaming right now. When I say simultaneous game turn, what I mean is the turn that you are having, both players are taking part in it at the same time. So during a turn, what happens in a game of Mercs is you roll a d10 at the beginning of the turn, top of the turn, for every single one of your models in your team. And that becomes their initiative. You then go from highest to lowest, 10 to 1. If two models are tied on either side or in the same force, models have what's called a reaction. It's like their initiative in Warhammer 40k or Warhammer Fantasy. It's basically how fast they are. That's used for a whole bunch of different things, but primarily in a game of Mercs, it's used to keep track of the speed with which you're going to break ties during the initiative bands. It's also used in melee and close combat. So that's the first one, simultaneous game turn. The next one you don't see in a lot of games is points-free squad creation. So when I say points-free squad creation, what I mean is a system for making your squad that doesn't rely on point values. It relies on like just slots. So for instance, every game of Mercs, instead of having a point size, has a team size. You can, on average, you can play with 5 models. That's your team size in Mercs. And in that game, in that size, the game flows pretty well. It takes about 45 to an hour to play, and you get a decent representation of all the models in the team. It also creates some limits, so you can't have everything, and you're required to sort of pick and choose what models you include from your selection to get yourself to the 5 that's going to work well together. Now, most of the Mercs teams at this point have about 8 models available to them. Brian said that his plan is to do 10 for each team, and then you pick down to 5, basically. Initially, I think there was 5 for each team, and then as they've been added, they basically just get slotted into the roster. So you'll see most of my teams are 6 or 7 guys. My earlier teams have more models. I have unpainted guys for some of my teams too, because I haven't picked up the most recent sort of like iterations of Mercs. I haven't been playing it a whole bunch. That's sort of like the system for force creation that's used in this game. Now, what does that mean? It means the games are fairly balanced, and that a guy with a rifle is a guy with a rifle is a guy with a rifle, because that's a sort of reality. And whenever you get something in this game, you tend to trade off for it. So if you've got cool, big, heavy machine guns, you're typically fairly well armored. You're usually kind of slow. And getting to fire machine guns isn't as easy necessarily in a game of Mercs as it is in another miniature game. So there's another one, simultaneous game turn. 2D and 3D play supported. So now, one of the things that Brian and the MegaCon games team has done is they've released a whole bunch of board games. And actually, what I'm talking to you about today is first edition Mercs, so the first edition of the game, which is covered in this rule book right here, as well as some web addendums and a bunch of FAQs that I actually helped write. So now this right here is the initial sort of like rule set for Mercs. Mercs 2.0 was launched or planned as part of the Mercs Tactics and Mercs Conflict Kickstarter. And that Kickstarter was for a board game version of Mercs, using the same models that took place, doing like breaching actions and stuff in office buildings, and it's very cool. It's not actually out yet. I did back it, and I'll hopefully be able to show it to you guys when it comes in. But the game that we're playing right now will probably be updated into a 2.0 version of Mercs Tabletop sometime in this year in 2015. So when I say 2D and 3D play, what I mean is you can play this on a mat, and I'll show you guys the mat when I show you the materials, because I actually have the Gale Force 9 mats that were briefly available, and you can actually print them out off their website with 2D terrain. So some of the card packs that you buy, when you buy the card packs for the guys, they come with terrain features, and what's cool is the rules for that terrain feature are actually just put right on the card. So for instance, this is a barricade. It has an elevation rating of 1, meaning it provides cover to basically anything elevation rating 2 or higher, and it blocks line of sight to elevation 1 and less. Now, also the mats have elevation ratings and stuff written on them as well, so you always know what you're doing. And it's great for model placement because there's another feature to this game that I'll show you in a second that means that when you're using a 2D mat, it's actually significantly easier to play the game. Now, it does lead to some abstraction. Elevations and stuff create a level of abstraction because you're playing on a 2D surface. You have to be able to bend your mind around that. That's one way of playing the game. Now, the rules were kind of written with the 2D version in mind. There is a way to play it 3D, and actually I have a 3D table set up over here with using like normal sort of wargaming looking 3D terrain, and you discard certain rules and certain types of movement, and there's a sort of easier to play way of measuring that isn't quite as precise as the 2D version, but it lets you play around terrain and stuff like that as well. So there we have it. That is our sort of like 2 different play styles that we can do. I'm going to show you both when I show you the materials. Now, the next one is, it doesn't use traditional measurement styles. It's not measured in inches and centimeters for movement. It's actually measured in cards. Now I have this handy measuring gauge right here, which you could buy as an additional thing. It's cut out of latex, but the cards themselves that all your unit stats come on are cut the exact same way and you used card movement. So if you replace inch or centimeter in your head with card, that's how far you would move. And when I show movement, I'm gonna do the demo of this game in the vault, you'll be able to see how that actually works. So all ranges were done in card length, so you just lay cards in between you and your opponent to see how many cards away you could fire. And all movements were done from this big circle at the bottom, basically to one of the other circles, anywhere in your front 180-degree arc. So it's an interesting way of doing measurements. It's certainly a great packaging thing, because when you bought Mercs Minis and they came with the cards for them, you had your measuring device already. It means that there's a lot less stuff to carry around. You really just need your dice and your counters. I have aftermarket counters too for everything. You didn't have to have counters, you could print counters, but I have kind of everything to play the game. So this was a kind of unique format, was you would move using actually the stat card for the guy around the table. Now, the next thing that's kind of interesting is your armor. Now, a lot of these guys are wearing like powered armor. Actually, I would say pretty much every Mercs miniature is wearing powered armor. There's only a few miniatures that are not wearing armor and that aren't subject to this rule, but everybody wearing power armor in this game can suffer armor failure. You're wearing a super advanced robot suit, but because it's a robot suit, it's not part of your body, it can break down, and that will jam you up during the game. In most games, you don't actually get to that level of detail. If a guy's wearing power armor, it works until he's dead. And that's it. Or you incorporate the fact that it's malfunctioned somehow into whether or not he's able to, whether or not he's alive or dead on the table. Because dead can mean lots of things. It can mean unconscious. It can mean his suit's his suit's incapacitated or whatever it is. In this one, if your armor breaks, you become immobilized and you can't really do anything until you fix your armor. So there's certain models that when their armor breaks, it's a really big deal. And if you equal someone's armor in this, you might not do damage, but you will force an armor break check. And every time you do damage, you force an armor break check too. So kind of a big deal. And yeah, definitely a unique mechanic to this game is that power armor guys can actually have their armor malfunction. And then finally, it focuses on cover and maneuvering more than really what the guy is. Now, I said it uses points-free team creation. And what that means is, when I say a guy is a guy is a guy, there's not a huge amount of variation between models. What they're armed with can vary quite a bit, their skills can vary quite a bit, but for the most part, an infantryman is an infantryman with a rifle. And this game really rewards maneuvering. It actually makes it a lot harder to maneuver, but it rewards maneuvering sort of way more than it rewards being a beefcake Rambo sort of a model. So there's not a lot of Rambo superhero models that can go it on their own in this game, that you have to use your team in conjunction with one another to win. And I would say that's it's not unique to this game, but it's definitely not it's not as, how would I say, movement and orientation simplified as mass combat games are. It does really take into account that this is a small firefight and that where you are positioned and what you are doing and the angles that you can see are far more important than, let's say, a mass combat game like 40K or even things like War Machine. So that's a huge sort of like mechanic in this game. You only have 5 guys, they're a limited resource, and taking advantage of cover and stuff is a huge deal. The last one is movement. And now movement, sorry, not just movement, but your actions. You have an action each game. You can take one. And that can be to move, to make a combat action, which is to do things like use your med kit, fire your gun, whatever, or hold. Hold just allows you to go at a lower initiative and basically not act yet. You can act later on. Now those three things, they can be used in different combination, but you only do one of them each turn. Now certain guys have certain special rules like move plus fire. That's a rule that'll be on their card. Not everyone can do it. Only certain guys can do it. And that allows you to take both those actions together, but at a penalty. So you move one less and you shoot at a penalty basically to combine those two skills. And not everybody can do it. What that means is you might find yourself moving with models and not doing anything else during a turn. So leapfrogging, setting up overlapping fields of fire becomes a really big deal in this game. There's a final mechanic that I think is really cool called snap to cover. And what snap to cover is, if you are within a 30mm base length, and I actually made this little tab by measuring 30mm base lengths of a piece of cover at the end of your move or anytime during your turn, you can snap to it. That's a free move, doesn't count as part of your action, and it basically just allows you to keep your facing, but move into contact with cover. Cover is so important in this game that they give you a free movement every turn. You can snap, and you can use snap to cover too to walk along walls. You can kind of sort of leapfrog along walls as long as you maintain contact with stuff to move and do things like shots. And that represents kind of creeping around, taking shots, looking at windows, stuff like that. So even though you're not making a movement action, you can still get a tiny bit of movement around the table during your turn, not feel like you're totally immobile. So those are the mechanics I thought were kind of unique. They allow for, I think, a pretty cool tactical board game, miniature game hybrid. It can be played as either, and I think that you guys are going to enjoy watching the game. So let's take a look now at the materials, because I think that's an interesting thing to do. Is this game has some kind of unique materials. You can see the board setups for the two games, and then we'll wrap this up. And if you want to join me in the vault, we'll talk about that in a second. All right, guys, so here's a couple looks at the game sort of in progress. We've got two layouts here. We've got a 2D layout and a 3D layout. So I'm going to show you the 2D one first. These are all my Mercs teams, by the way. I painted them, and it's all my Mercs stuff. So if you're asking where it came from, this was all just the stuff I had for Mercs. Here's an example of a team. This is my FCC team. These are the guys that live in the Lost Margin and are basically freedom fighters. So they look a little ragtag. And you can see in front of them the basic synopsis of the game. So the game turn, chain of occurrence, how things happen, and then some modifiers for shooting. So super handy. You can learn most of the game rules off these cards. I just keep them handy during the game. The cards themselves, you can see here, there's all of them. They're divoted out for the movements, and I'll show you the movement in a second, actually, in the demo. And then sometimes you have cards for extra things. This is a piece of gear. This is a laser trap that can get dropped on the table during the game that people walk through to take damage. Some guys on the side here, because I got my 5-man teams on the table, my extra models on one side. This is the CCC Heavy Assault and the Cephalid Gunner. And then we have a 2D map. Now, Gale Force 9 made these mats. I don't think they're in production anymore, but you can still buy them. Or sorry, not buy them. You can still download printable maps off the MegaCon Games website. Now you can see I've got two teams here. They're trying to assault a building. There's the ER of this building, so the wall is ER10, meaning nothing can see over it. Same with this big round thing in the middle here. So imagine this is a huge silo sitting up out of the ground. These are some raised platforms. Those are stairs going up and down. It's level 2. And then the walls themselves block line of sight. You also get terrain features in your blister packs. This is a wall. It's ER1 sitting over here. A little pillbox you can go into, a little pillbox, and some razor wire. This one's -1 movement point. So basically they always say what they do on them whenever you're there. I've also got my team laid out. So what you would do during a game is you would roll your initiative dice and just place it with, this guy's a 6, place it with your guys you go along, and then that's how you're activating your team. My tokens. So these are a bunch of effects tokens. These are your blood tokens and your status tokens, and then this is, of course, your measuring token. When you measure, it's real simple. You place the templates anywhere in his front 180, so you can see all my arcs are marked off at front 180, and then you would move him to another divot in his front 180. So he wouldn't be able to move to this one, because it's outside his front 180. He'd have to go change facing, which costs him a movement point. Now he can go up to this one right here. He could go, if it would fit, he could rotate it. So he goes sideways like that for each of his movement points. That's basically how this thing works. Now on this side, we've got my 3D terrain set up. Now this is, if you're asking where the table came from, this is an X-Illus table, a game you've probably never heard of because it no longer exists. And really the best thing they made was this table. It's a plastic 9x9 tile table. So this is slightly too big. You're supposed to play Mercs on a 2x3 surface. I play it on a 27-inch by 3-foot surface. So it's a little bit wide, but we've never really had a problem having additional space on the flanks. And the table looks really good. So this is my USC army. This is my Lost Margin table. So it represents the ruins of like Eastern Europe where these armies are fighting, sort of post-nuclear. And then we've got my USCR guys, which is the Behemoth, the Assault Leader, the Commissar, That's a medic. We've got a sniper and a monkey wrench, and then the booster's off the table here, hanging it with his card. And fighting them is the Kize-Waza, which is the sort of post-nuclear Asia-Pacific faction. They are the ones that can launch attack nuke. So right here, he's actually got a small tactical nuclear weapon on his back. And he can be guided in by his Pathfinder and his forward observer to drop it on somebody. It's pretty crazy when you get it off. It's kind of a one-trick pony though. It's not super easy to use. They got a grenadier and a sniper over here as well. There's a laser sniper. So there's my Waza and my USCR. And then over here we've got the extra guys. So that's the heavy hybrid for the Kize-Waza and the booster for the USCR, the old booster actually. This is my Chemvar. They're the South American assassin-y super fast guys. And there's their card pile right there. So that's basically what you need to play. You need a 2x3 surface, you need some terrain. It's recommended for terrain setup. When you do set it up, you block line of sight to either side. That's why I've got these big blocks of terrain in the middle, basically keeping you from being able to see from side to side. Likewise, this building does pretty much the same thing. Other than that, lots of scatter, lots of things to snap to cover to. A dense table is a good table, and you're pretty much ready to play. So there's a walk through the materials. You guys can see some of my factions and my table setups. And yeah, and what you would need to play. So you could buy some starters. The starters come with the cards for your faction. They come with usually a 6-man team and your dice. And those are available from MegaCon Games if you want to check it out. All right, guys, so thanks for watching my first indie games spotlight on Mercs Miniatures from MegaCon Games. If you would like to check out a quick demo of the game, because I'm going to be demoing the game and showing 3 turns of the system, that's going to be in the vault. So you can click the link below. That's for our vault members to check it out actually in action. See me and one of the MiniWarGaming staff members throw some dice, check around, and check out how the rules actually work in real time, so live fire. And you can see the stuff I described sort of happening on the tabletop in front of you. So yeah, click the link below. If you're not already a vault member, you can click the link anyway, and that'll give you a 7-day free trial. That's going to give you access to half of everything we do here at MiniWarGaming. So that's Infinity, 40K, War Machine, Warhammer Fantasy Battle, all of our painting tips and tricks with Chris, as well as half of, well, any demos that I do for Indie Gaming Spotlight will be in the vault. So we hope you enjoy it. We'll see you in there. Thanks again for watching. And if you do have an idea, if you're a developer, or if you're a person who just loves a certain game, an indie game that you think deserves some coverage and a little bit of love, we do these once a month. Email me, ash@miniwargaming.com. Remember the proviso though, if I don't already play the game, and I do play a lot of games, but by no means do I play every miniature game under the sun, you should be prepared to send us some rules, some miniatures, so we can showcase it properly. And if we pick you, then yeah, we'll be ready to go. So drop me an email, we'll chat, and I hope you enjoyed this little series. So we'll talk to you in the comments. You can hit me up here on the MiniWarGaming page, my email, ash@miniwargaming.com, or on my Facebook page, which is facebook.com/out of the basement into the streets. And we'll chat about indie spotlights and about indie games in general, because I love indie games. So we'll see you then. Until then, happy wargaming.